Welcome to the LocoFoco Netcast. My name is Timothy Virkkala, at Workman on social media. That's Workman with an I, not an O. And today we're going to be joined by Dennis Pratt, the Libertarian master of Quora, Quora.com. It's exciting to be here talking to you. It's exciting for me because you are the greatest Quoran on the planet. I started in 2013, but I couldn't find what date you started.
Yeah, I think I started, well, I'm 3 years and a quarter into it. So that would be 2016. I think it was December 4th, 2016.
What got you into Quora? What was your interest in Quora?
Well, I've always been interested in personal freedom and in human freedom. It's always been a major avocation for me. And I came from it from the left, but definitely the push was human freedom, allowing people to be freer. I discovered libertarianism in the 80s, and I spent a lot of my time arguing with people about how freedom could best be implemented. And but I was doing other things. I was starting up companies. And then when I stopped doing that, I was starting up charities, but always with an idea of how could this actually advance human freedom. My last charity startup was actually one that Mary Ruart had inspired me to start up, and it became the largest in-person personal growth group in the world. We were doing 250 events a year. We had 4,500 members here in just the Boston area. But for me, it was an attempt to remove the blocks that prevent us from reaching our potential that we hold internally. And I had seen in all these types of courses that at the end, people actually have this live and let live ethic that we embrace. They come in and they're suspicious of other people, and they don't like other people, and they're judgmental. But by the end, they see each other's humanness and they see each other's uniqueness. And even though someone's on a path that's different from them, they kind of go, well, I wouldn't do that, but I understand what you're doing, and I want to support you in your path. And it was a beautiful thing. And so I thought that of all the efforts that I had done to, for my advocation of advancing human freedom, that was probably the best thing to do. And then Trump got elected. And Are
you telling me you're a post-Trumpian Quoran?
I'm a post-Trumpian Quoran.
Wow. And
it was actually Trump, or the reaction to Trump, that caused me to give up on my personal growth empire. It was gigantic. And then to start learning how to write on Quora. But what happened was all of the, so Boston is a very progressive area. All my friends are leftists and that type of thing. And so even though we had this beautiful, group of people who were supportive and stuff like that, when Trump got elected, they all turned hateful. And we would go into these workshops and stuff, and almost immediately it would become kind of a democratic hate fest. And I was like looking around going, wait. This is going in the opposite direction. We should be going towards love, towards tolerance, towards understanding one another. And they were using their participation in personal growth as an indication why they were so better, and therefore they should use the government to womp on those guys. And that was when I lost all faith at my back. I had done stuff around homeschooling and alternative school startups. And that's when I kind of said, all these indirect measures haven't really worked that well for me. All my conversations at cocktail parties haven't really worked that well for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write directly about the beauty that I see in libertarianism. I had bumped into Quora before. I thought it would be a good fishing hole, and that's actually what I want to tell your listeners, that the first thing you want to do is find a good listening hole, because frankly, the Thanksgiving dinner table is probably one of the worst fishing holes you can have. You know, those people are going to dismiss you. They're not interested in what you have to say. But with Quora, we have a group of people who are at least self-identifying as intellectual, as curious about ideas, as not wedded to the current thought. Now, whether most of them are or not is another question. But these at least are identifying as that set of person. And I think that Quora is just fabulous for libertarianism. Most of the people we talk to will never become libertarian. And so if you're spending your life trying to convince Grandma Moses to become libertarian, you're wasting your life. And there's very few of us out here. So what you need to do is you need to find that small, teeny sliver of humanity. I call it the open and curious set. Okay, they're open to these eyes, they're curious about them, and they're not going to freak out almost immediately. They're going to be, well, tell me a little bit more, or why this, or why, and we can actually have a discussion. So I gave up on all my other charities and stuff, and I just started writing full-time on Quora. Turns out that I wasn't that good a writer, but I'm a nerd, so I just learned how to write better. And Quora is great because it gives you feedback on how successful your writing is. So I pay, I'm good at looking at feedback and kind of thinking about stuff. I also iterate a lot. It takes me about 4 hours to write a Quora answer. And I go through multiple iterations before I even post it. But once I post it, I'll go through another 10 or 12 iterations of that answer once it's posted in just the next week. Especially as I see how people are kind of reacting to it.
And when you say iterations in that week, are you talking about revising the original piece? Are you talking about answering questions that comments that follow? What are you talking about?
Revising the original piece. What I'm looking for is I have an inkling of an idea that I want to convey to people. For those who don't know, Quora is a question or answer forum. So the QU in Quora stands for question, and the A stands for answer. And so people will ask questions, and very few of them are in the libertarian area. It turns out that there's about, 20,000 questions now around libertarianism. So there's a rich body of questions. But so I'll see a question, I'll have an inkling of an idea. How can I convey this? I have to really fight hard with myself and on my own assumptions. How can I talk to the person that I really want to reach, which is that open and curious person, the person who's, just kind of, he's drinking his coffee, he's thinking about things, he comes across this question, he starts reading, and I want to appeal to that person that, okay, look, here's something that you've never heard of, here's something that you've been told is evil or fascist, but let me explain this to you the way that I see it. That this is actually supportive of human beings. This is actually how we want to treat one another long term. And there's consequences to that. And the consequences you may say, well, we're not ready for, but let's talk about that, whether that's true or not. So I have to think about that, and when I post it, I have it pretty good, but I have 1,400 answers. I have 1,200 answers that have failed that are in my draft folders. And a lot of those I've spent a lot of time trying to get and mold to an answer. And it just collapses. I don't know how to communicate these ideas. These are hard ideas to communicate given the indoctrination soup in which we sit. So, I'm almost 50-50. When I start an answer, there's about a 50% chance I'll actually complete it. And it'll take me like 4 hours to finish. And then, even then, my answer isn't good. And so I get answers, I get responses from comments, I get responses in terms of whether people are upvoting it or not. I look at it, I go, well, maybe this or maybe that, and I'll tweak it and iterate it until I go, that's about as good as I can do with my skill level as it is right now. And I'll return to it a year later or something and try to improve it then.
Well, that's very much a learning process for you, and you're basically adapting to the circumstances that you're actually in, which is in its own way the kind of heroism we're expecting of everybody, right?
Yeah. It's certainly a humble approach, right? It's a humble approach saying that I'm not. I'll write to people, and on Quora there's questions of how you write on Quora and how do you get people to understand your answers, and I get a lot of those questions because I'm a successful Quoran. But I tell people, look, I'm not that good a writer. That's not what I'm trained in. I'm an MIT nerd. What I'm good at is learning. Okay, what I'm good at is being humble enough to say, this sucks, let me improve it. This sucks less. And I want to get up to a suckiness level where I go, I can live with this suckiness. I then post it, but then I improve it to, okay, this doesn't suck as badly. If one of my answers gets 5% upvotes, so of those people who read my answer, 5% upvote it, I consider that a gigantic win. Every once in a while, I'll get 10%. And I'm shocked. I'm absolutely shocked. Now, there are people who get higher percentages, but they're not as didactic as I am, right? I'm actually trying to convey these ideas.
Now, I also write on Quora. I mean, like I said, 2013, but I don't try to be as good as you. I don't spend as much time at it. I'm very fast, and I'll publish something. And it's usually out of my head because I'm not going to bother to get links for people. Almost never. I don't do any work for Quora. I answer a question and I leave. And then I come back and then I start making corrections. So you also correct. Do you have any problem when you make really huge changes, or do you make small changes in your answers?
Every once in a while, I'll understand that a section is just not working, or that I took it too far off the main topic, and I'll throw it down into a footnote. If you actually go through my old stuff, you'll see things that say footnote 1, and there's just a side discussion. So I'll do that type of arrangement, but generally the structure, when I get the inspiration, so I read a lot of questions. I'm asked to answer a lot of questions. I'll read a lot of questions, and just depending on how I feel that day, and so I'll feel inspired to respond to something. Trying to get that inspiration out and communicate the vision that I see. I talk about it like, trying to you have a beautiful scene and you try to describe it through a cocktail straw. How do you do that? The structure usually comes to me, and I'm pretty happy with the structure, but I have to be extremely careful with how I phrase things. I have to think about people who are just not aware of the idea of freedom, of people not being subjugated, of people of kind of a goal of allowing each other to live their own lives as long as they don't hurt anyone. It's hard to put myself back in that place. I mean, I was in that place in 1979, 1980. I'm not in that place now. I'm decades away from that place. I have to kind of put myself back in. And luckily, we have a comment section where people are more than happy to explain.
Yeah. Well, they explain where they're coming from as well, I assume. Though often they're very nasty. At least it's been my experience, is that there's a lot of weird responses on Quora. Of course, many of the questions are loaded in a weird way, like they're loaded to get a particular kind of answer, and then it's our job to show a way out of that trap, because they're setting a trap. Do you answer those kind of questions, or do you stick to more earnest questions?
Actually, I like those questions. There's a difficulty with them because sometimes I'll spend a lot of time answering one of those questions, and then one of our other libertarians will report the question as being not earnest, and they'll collapse the question, and my answer won't get seen, and it's like so frustrating. But one of my favorite classes of question is, why are libertarians so blank, right? And so, I have two that I answered rather early that I really love. Why are libertarians so narcissistic? So I said, okay, so let's go to the psychological definition of narcissism. And I went through the 9 indications of narcissism. And I basically said, okay, well, let's look at this one. Is a libertarian or an authoritarian more narcissistic on this scale? And and each question, of course, authoritarians who are trying to impose their view of the world, their preferences on every single other human being, has to be more narcissistic. I could have made that point really quickly, but I took 9 questions and said, well, and on this particular dimension, it looks like the authoritarian is more narcissistic. And so I kept a running score at the bottom, and well, it's 0 to 1. 0 to 2, 0 to 3, but maybe the next one, maybe we'll find how libertarians are narcissistic. Oh, 0 to 5. So I like answering those types of questions because they come from such a confused state. And I think the thing that I do that's really different, I do a number of things that are really different from my libertarian friends. We have about 100 libertarian writers on Quora. And one of the things is that I write to that open and curious set. No matter what who the person was who asked the question, how angry or confused they were, I say, oh, well, here's this class of question. You who are open and curious, let's see, does this make any sense? So I always am thinking, I always hold an image of that open and curious reader. What happened early on when I first went to Quora, we had a bunch of libertarian writers who felt besieged because they were getting hit with so many outlandish questions and straw men and ad hominems and stuff. And they would respond to the anti-libertarians, the people who were trying to undermine us. And so what you got was, when you read some of these answers, was a lot of anger. And libertarianism is probably the most joyous ethic that's out there. It's probably the most loving ethic that's out there, which is really odd that it takes a bunch of people who are pretty high on that Aspie level to to say no. If you really want empathy, right? If you really want empathy, you have to be libertarian. So what was happening was, because we were responding to the anti-libertarians, we were missing communicating by our method our real message. So our words might have been okay, but the method, the anger, was not. And it was just off message. So, I do a lot where I ask libertarians, be conscious of whom you're writing to, because the anti-libertarian is never going to get it. There's no reason to spend 1 second on that anti-libertarian, right? So the anti-libertarian responds to something or asks a question or makes a comment. You have no onus to actually support that person. Whom you're writing to is the passerby who is in that open and curious segment, who's kind of going, oh, he sees the anti-libertarian's question and goes, oh, I didn't know libertarians were so narcissistic. And then you go, well, okay, is that a reasonable position? Let's look at this. Let's sit and be rational about this. I think that's one of the things that I do that's actually been very successful for me, is I focus only on the open and curious, and I write in the way that libertarianism is, which is tolerant, open, voluntary, consensual, I respect you type of way.
That comes across. It really does. I mean, that's one of the reasons I called you the top libertarian on Quora, if that's what I called you. That's what I should have called you, the top libertarian on Quora. Now, Quora gives out little awards every year about being a top Quoran or top, what do they say? What's the term?
It's a top writer.
Top writer. Now, I was that last year, and this year I've gotten a few of my answers demoted. So I feel that I'm not going to be a top Quoran for this year. Do you get very many answers demoted, hidden, whatever they do?
I do. I get a number of answers collapsed, which is always very hard for me, because it was so hard for me to write those answers. And it's so much of a part of my life that I invested in that answer. And I take steps around it to kind of protect myself. I do challenge them, and because I do write in a friendly, open way, I've won a lot of those challenges. But I lose them too. And I've never gotten top writer, even though I'm the #1 writer on libertarian topics and that type of thing. Because I have people who actually actively follow me and downvote me, and the anti-libertarian people who want to subjugate others, we are a direct challenge to their power, right? So it's not that we're not friendly and not respectful. It's that they want power over others. They want this kind of slave system that they can control. And when somebody actually writes eloquently against that is a direct threat to them, and they're willing to do whatever they do. And there's so many more of them than there are of us. So I urge our libertarian writers support one another. Upvote and thank and share, and and as a matter of fact, I've actually shifted over the last 4 months. I became the administrator of our libertarian space on Quora,
which is called something.
Liberty at Large, it's called. It wasn't going well. It was really poor. We were getting about 700 or so views per day. We're now around 7,000. So in three months, I've increased the viewership by a factor of 10. And I'm really proud of that. But what it's caused me not to be writing as much. I guess that's what I'm saying. I'm just not writing that much. And instead, what I'm doing is building this space where we're going to Reason and Cato and Mises and other people's blogs and good writers like yourself in Quora, and we're saying, if you're really interested in libertarianism, look at this. Oh, here's another one. Look at. Here's another one. Look at. So that we can capture those open and curious, and they're not just following one person, right? If you follow me, you're going to get a particular view of libertarianism. I come at it from a very ethical perspective. And I think that's a winning strategy, and I'll talk about that later. But it's a very particular view, and it's a minority view. At Liberty at Large, you can get all these different perspectives from all these different writers, and so I'm hoping. I don't know how to spread libertarianism. I know that that's how I want to invest the remainder of my life. I know that that's a big driver for me. When I'm lying on my bed, one of the questions I'm going to ask is, have I made the world better? And I believe that adding in peace, love, understanding, tolerance, respect, moving our society away from the hate, the subjugation, the enslavement, the violence, the brutality of statism, and moving it toward that, I actually will think that was a good life. For me, that's a good life. So, that was the reason why I left Personal Growth Network almost entirely and focused only on writing on Quora. I have cancer. I'm, going through treatments and stuff like that. So I'm really aware of how much I have left. And I wish I knew the answer of how we can actually spread this philosophy. I have some guesses after 4 decades of trying to do it and failing mostly. And what I'm hoping is that I can actually find a few people out there who will pick up the mantle and actually continue. And so my little ripples will start other little ripples and stuff.
That's how it works, right? That is really, that's what we know. If we didn't learn it from Hayek, we learned it from experience. Now, one of the things that I learned yesterday when I talked to you was that you have a very interesting and different history of coming to libertarian ideas. Because now, I have a friend named Paul Jacob, and he was born basically into a libertarian household, like a conservative libertarian household. So the ideas were there, and he never was really anything but a libertarian. Mm-hmm. I was born into a very different household. I mean, it was not a anti-libertarian household, but my father was a Democrat of the Scoop Jackson variety.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was a mugwump, as he referred to her. She would vote for whoever was the best. And they were socially conservative. And I came to liberty from thinking about Christianity and ethics and social philosophy. And I got all of a sudden very interested in anarchism. And I read Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia when I was 17.
Mm.
And that set me on a course. So I come from the school of Nozick. Most libertarians seem to come from the school of Ayn Rand. At least when I was younger and first entering libertarian in the 80s, everybody was, it usually begins with Ayn Rand as a book by Jerome de Chile, a hilarious book about the personal history of people coming to libertarian ideas. But your coming to libertarianism is different. Could you explain that?
Yeah, well, I'm in that quarter of the libertarian population that comes from the left. And as a matter of fact, when I first started libertarianism, it was higher because we're coming out of those anti-war years. And so the left's actual presence within libertarianism was a higher percentage. Now we skew about 70%, 75% conservative background. But I was a pretty strong leftist. I was a social democrat during the 70s. Out in the streets, protesting, closing down Northwestern University's campus. I took over the provost office. My picture was actually on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, taking over the provost office. And then I was out at Colorado and protesting against Rocky Flats nuclear plant, and listening to Bonnie Raitt concerts. So I was just so far over on the left. I returned to Chicago. And I was working at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is a commodities trade. And my boss was this like super arch conservative, and we used to kind of nettle each other about it. But he really respected me. I really respected him. He left to start up a company, which was my first introduction to startups. And he hired me as his first employee. He said, "Oh, you have to come and work for me." And it was a startup situation. So we worked 7 days a week. We worked, 10, 15 hours a day, sometimes even sleeping there. And we were, I was doing most of the specification, and then I taught myself coding. And then we were coding a lot. And the way that we would entertain ourselves when it was just getting so bored is we would bitch at each other about politics. And it was so much fun because, well, first of all, we were just so diametrically opposed to one another. But the really good thing, and this was something that I didn't realize until until all these decades of talking to other people, was that he and I shared one characteristic. We couldn't countenance contradictions. That to us, a contradiction was that something was wrong in our thinking. And so, we would forever catch each other in these contradictions. Well, you said this, but then how can you be for that? Or, there would be silence as the other person was happily, the other person was the speaker was happily typing away, thinking that they had scored points. Another person was thinking about it. And they'd come back and say, well, but what about this? But over a year time frame, this startup lasted for about a year and a half. Over about a year time frame, he moved totally off of the social conservative sides, right? He totally bought my, this is your body, you own it. How does anyone have any rights whatsoever? He also came off of the foreign intervention, which I thought was just fantastic. That to me has always been like the major piece. I had to come off of the economic intervention. And I hadn't really thought through those issues, but how those were tied to the body ownership and to the intervention in the foreign, and and that it was all one set of things. And I remember one day we were coding, and I was getting bored, and I was looking for a topic that I could actually bitch at him about. And I'm thinking, I can't come up with anything. After a couple of hours, I said, so that's it. We don't have any more disagreements. And a couple of hours later, he said, yeah, I can't think of anything. And we sat for about 6 months, 8 months, thinking that we had invented something new. I was on a Chicago bus. It was winter. It was, you know, the slush, dirty pieces of snow on the bottom, and there was a leaflet on the floor. And I was like, you know, I was bored, so I was like reading it upside down, and I'm reading it. And I'm going, what? I pick it up and it's dripping wet with of this black, you know, mucus type of, you know, I don't know what happens with Chicago snow, but it's horrible stuff. And I jump off the bus and I find a payphone. I call my friend and I said, I know what we are. There's a name for what we are. We're libertarians. And it was the first time I'd ever seen the term, ever heard the term. It would be probably another year or two before I ever heard someone else say the term. So for me, it was more of an investigation starting from first principles. And that's actually what I communicate a lot in Quora. You know, I start all of my answers with the ethic that we each own our own bodies, fully and exclusively. And that if we do not own our own bodies fully, there are all these contradictions that occur. And from there, I derive ownership of labor, which is just the movement of one's body, and ownership of property, which is continuing to own that part of your body that you've invested into an object, that you've entwined into an object. You know, your lifespan, the wear and tear of your body, and that's all still there in that. You know, you don't actually own the lamp; you own your labor that's entwined there, and that's really what we're trading. We're just trading our bodies when we trade. And so I start all of my libertarianism from that single premise, that single right to own one's body. And then the implications just fall out from there. And it's really nice. And most people haven't actually heard that argument. Most people, you know, they look at some one issue, you know, drugs or prisons or something like that, and they think it's some sort of isolated point. No. It's not an isolated point. It stems from this belief that we all own ourselves, that we all own our bodies. And if you contradict that, well, it just leads to all these other contradictions, and you're basically arguing for slavery, which is, you know, in my view, the opposite of libertarianism.
Didn't you quote Father Sadowsky the other day?
No, I didn't, but yes. Father Sadowsky had a gigantic impact on my life.
I was wondering if he did, because that's the way you're phrasing everything is the idea of 100% ownership, which is really a Rothbardian idea as well. I mean, Rothbard said it too, and it's been said by other people over the time, but that is a very persuasive mechanism for some. And you have really run with it in in a persuasive way on Quora.
I met Father Sadowsky in 85 at a Cato University retreat at Dartmouth. I'm an atheist that used to be a Catholic. And I actually went to Catholic high school, and I loved religion class. It was like the only time that we could actually, you know, talking with the Jesuits and actually kind of logically trying to frame this stuff. And Father Sadowsky, I just loved the man. I loved talking with him. I think that was a very privileged. I think it was only 4 or 5 days that I was there, and I really treasure the insights that he gave me. And yes, he is certainly one of my inspirations on this line of argument.
And another point that we've talked about, and you bring up often, is the idea of a diversity of loyalties, is that we don't have to give up all of our allegiances to be free. There's a term for it that was invented in the late 19th century that no one knows. That's how rare these ideas are, is that the term for what we're talking about, almost no one, even in the libertarian movement, knows. It's called panarchism. And yesterday you expressed to me, basically, that was one of the two ideas that you thought was really, really important. You lead with ethics, the idea of owning yourself, and basically the basic idea of freedom. And then the other idea is that you can have your welfare state, you just can't force it on others.
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit about some of the inherent contradictions in some of the other approaches to libertarianism. And I think, you know, I mean, a lot of libertarians do come to libertarianism because, you know, they share with us a dis-ease with contradictions. But the idea that we would vote in a libertarian system that would force everybody else to live like a libertarian is a contradiction. And I think that the panarchist perspective, I mean, I call it kind of a voluntarist perspective, but the panarchist perspective is absolutely right. You know, it's kind of like the church. Why do we have to have one church imposed on everyone? Now, there was a period of time when that was just common sense. And that, of course, we must do that. That's the only possible way to live. And anybody disagreeing, we need to kill viciously for heresy. And that's what humans did. And all the common masses believe that was true. We now live in a time and in a culture where, you know, that the idea that you wouldn't have a selection of beliefs available to you it's just like kind of crazy. Well, that's true of us around governance. You know, if you want to follow Bernie, or you want to follow Hillary, or you want to follow Donald, or you want to follow yourself or Ron Paul or whomever, why don't you? Why can't you? Why can't you do that? You don't need to force your neighbor to do it, though. Your neighbor may be really interested in Hillary or something. So she lives her life as she chooses, following the dictates of Hillary. And you live your life as you choose, following the dictates of Ron Paul or of Tom Woods or of whomever. And someone else lives their life following the dictates of Donald. Now, there's all these questions about contiguous land and how do we handle that. And I think that there's good answers to that. But I mean, I don't think that that's where we're going to be. I think eventually we'll end up there. I think long term, that's where the human race is going to end up if we don't destroy ourselves. I think that the short term, you know, I'm part of the Free State Project. I think the short term is we aggregate all of the people who really, really love human freedom, that we think that this is important enough that we're going to dedicate part of our lives. And we aggregate in one area, and we make that area a model of human freedom. And we explore these ideas, and we work out the kinks. And because God knows we do not know how this is going to work. And as a matter of fact, the way it's going to work depends on who's there to work it, right? Who's there to build it. But I joined the Free State Project. You know, I've been around the Free State Project for a long time. I moved to the Free State a year and a half ago. And having lived in New York City and New Jersey and Chicago and Boulder and Boston, I have to tell you, it's like it's such a relief on my chest, and being able to breathe freely, and having so many people so interested in freedom, and having, you know, we have events every single day where people are talking about freedom and exploring freedom and looking at extending freedom this way. And I don't feel a besieged minority when I'm in New Hampshire. So I think that the short term, what we need to do is we need to create a small libertarian society somewhere where we can actually work these things out, and we can aggregate and support one another and build and demonstrate and slowly bring in, you know, the next level of diffusion, I think long term, we're going to treat governance like we treat lawn mowing services. You know, oh, you want your trees fertilized, and you want your shrubs trimmed, and okay, well, there's this one service here that will do that for you, and the next neighbor has a different service. And I think that's actually where we'll end up eventually if we get past all the murder and hate and threats that currently confront human beings.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I'm kind of on board, right? I'm a libertarian, and I'm.
Well, Tim, I noticed you're not yet in New Hampshire, so.
No, I'm not in New Hampshire. I'm still dubious about that idea, and it really isn't my objection to the Free State Project. It's really my lack of interest in your winters. You have a similar theme to one that I often make, that I often drum through, is that liberty lets cooperation occur. What we're talking about is cooperation between people, but what has to happen is that people have to be free to not cooperate, to let the good cooperation really flourish. And that, that right there is a challenge to a mind that wants to come up with a simple rubric. Okay, you want cooperation, so let's force people to cooperate. That is how many people think, right? And if we have to have this thing, then therefore we must all cooperate to get it. And they can't get over the fact that, cooperation works better when there's an exit. There's a loyalty problem. Hirschman, I think the economist is, who talked about loyalty, exit, and voice. And many people are addicted to voice. In fact, on the left, that seems to be one of the main concerns, is that you have your voice. You're included with the voice. You vote to express your voice. And then you succumb to whatever the majority demands, right? And this other idea that cooperation flourishes where non-cooperation is guaranteed, that is a hard pill for many people to swallow.
One of my favorite answers, which actually has never really done fantastically well, because I just think it's so hard for people to understand. I create the matrix of libertarian and authoritarian, and then individualism and communitarianism, right? And I say, look, what if we thought of this matrix as a matrix? What would each one of these squares, 4 squares, look like? And so I talk about the individualist authoritarian, the communitarian authoritarian, the libertarian individualist, and the libertarian communitarian. And really what we're talking about here is, don't forget this libertarian communitarian quadrant, because that's the only place where we can actually have community. The authoritarian communitarian is a prison camp. That is what they're talking about. Now, I have all these ministers, and I have in my family, and every time I go and visit my wife's family, I hear some sort of sermon, usually about the selfishness of certain people, and they're looking at me, and they don't understand this idea. They go, well, we need to cooperate, and they have fallen into the same trap that you're talking about. They've conflated authoritarian communitarianism with all community work. And no. We can work as a community voluntarily, and we can work as a community through threats of violence. Libertarians say the only real community is voluntary community. I talk about, I've started businesses, I've started charities, and, rather large charities and rather large movements. Every single one of mine has been voluntary. A lot of these are gigantic. So, the personal growth tends to be kind of a leftist area. And most of those guys create very small things. I went in there, I created this gigantic organization. We had over 100 different themes of personal growth. Everything from memory enhancement to relationship building to going for your goals and greater internal peace. All these pieces, people doing these things, and it was all voluntary. Now, the leftists who created these little microcosms, they couldn't understand, how do you actually create a voluntary community around these things, even though they're associated. Right? The target customer for this type of personal growth is also the target customer for this type of personal growth. It's just, these people are generally interested in improving their lives and inspection of their lives, and they're not scared to say that they made some errors in their lives. But they couldn't come up with the idea that I had, which I had from my libertarian perspective. Right? My libertarian perspective is, how do we cooperate more? How do we get all of these different communities, in the case of personal growth, all these isolated communities that were, very greedily, even though they're leftists, they were very greedily going, oh, I have my customer list and I won't share it with you. And I have my customer list, I won't share it with you. And what I did was I created like this very large community, 4,500 people in just the Boston area. And I said, I've got the biggest list. And you share yours with me. I'll share mine with you, and we just it just got gigantic. And we were doing all these events, and it was we had conferences, And so I think that quadrant, that libertarian communitarian quadrant, is such a rich area. It's something that we can uniquely do, and we're uniquely aware of it. Almost everyone else goes, oh, well, we have to run to the government in order to create community, right? And if we had done that with Personal Growth Network, the biggest guy would have just captured the government and said, oh, well, we're all going to do this type of personal growth. And and then I'll license people who can do this. And it would just been horrid. It's just been the normal, horrible authoritarian communitarianism that we experience. Instead, this is this open system of and things were and we were starting things. It was this hotbed of entrepreneurial activity, of offering different things, people coming in and getting different benefits. So I love that matrix. The difference between the libertarian and authoritarian on individualism and communitarianism. And I think that one quadrant, the libertarian communitarianism, is really where our biggest contribution will show up.
The objection to libertarianism is usually egoism. It's usually selfishness. It's usually you're just in it for yourself. That great old cliche, every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost, which is, I guess, every man for himself scattering, and the devil, whoever that is, picking off the weakest members right away. And that wasn't my vision. And it turns out that isn't the vision of the great libertarians of the past either. People don't really seem to understand this, is that they see freedom and they only see it through a weird lens, I guess, of their collectivism. But Adam Smith talked about sympathy. The first book was a book of ethics. It was not The Wealth of Nations, and it was a very interesting book. Herbert Spencer, who is much maligned as a social Darwinist and all these evil things, and they even called him an imperialist, though he wasn't. For 100 years, you couldn't say a good thing about Herbert Spencer in public. Yet, he was the main theorist of sympathy in the 19th century. It was he who explored that idea and its importance for all kinds of ethics, and which he meant the ethics of individual life, and then the justice, which is what we're talking about, is in the sphere of politics and law and that kind of thing. And then he went on to talk about beneficence in 2 volumes, which is benevolence, which is being good to each other. And even Ludwig von Mises talked about cooperation as the essence of what we're into here. The classical economists often talked excessively about competition because they realized something, that exit idea, that not cooperating leads to better cooperation. They really had an idea, but they talked about competition so much that most people, and I think most leftists, see competition as some winning and some losing, right? It's, the best people win and the losers lose, and that's it. That's not the world we're talking about. Because they don't see that every transaction we're engaged in, we're competing to cooperate. That's the thing. That's the phrase that I like to use the most, is that we're competing to cooperate in the market. And it's not just markets too. That's what's one of my other bugaboos. It's not really, communities aren't really markets, because you're not often exchanging things. You're often doing things together to share. That's not quite a market. It's not quite a market.
Yeah, well, I write about 90 themes.
90 themes. Okay, that's a nice economy.
Well, I actually went back. I created this large table of contents of all the different themes that I write about, and you count them up, and it goes, oh, it's about 90. And but one of them is money, and how confused we are about what money is. So from my ethical perspective, money is simply my labor, my time, my lifespan stored as potential energy. That's all it is. It's my body's lifespan as potential energy. I've done some other work. I've stored that labor, that body usage up in cash, and now I'm going to go use it somewhere else. So if I spend time in community, that's me actually doing that same labor, but without that intermediary of money. It's the same thing. And I could actually take money and hire someone else to do that. It would be my body transformed into doing that. And it's so funny because leftists don't see that unification a body with action, with human action, with human interaction, and then these temporary storage devices. They see the temporary storage device as something totally different, totally alien from human beings and from our bodies and from our labor. And to me, it's just a convenient storage device to move my labor from a place where it's really valued to a place I really want to spend it. You know, a portion of my answers are on our poor understanding of what money is and this kind of confused view of money, which I think a lot of economists get confused about, and which I have to say I think a lot of objectivists get confused about, because I believe that, you know, we do things, we act in the world because we have goals, we want things. I don't want a big pile of my past labors in storage. I mean, it's good to have it just in case something happens and I can utilize it for whatever I want. So it's good to kind of store this up as a backup. I agree with that. But what I really want is, you know, for example, I want human freedom. So I contribute to Quora using my past storage of labor, you know, which allows me to do this because that's the outcome that I want. Now, someone might say, "Oh, well, you're not doing it for money." I go with, you don't understand. The money allows my labor. This is, you know, it's so hard to kind of piece it together and try to describe. You know, you have a body, you can do this good act, or you can work to create create a temporary storage of your labor, your body, and then apply it to that good act. But what we all want are these things, and it might be family, it might be changing society, it might be, you know, some people might say, "Oh, well, geez, all I really want is sex and being a playboy," or so, whatever the heck it is that you guys want. You know, you can either do it directly and leave out the intermediary money, or you could do money and then do it, but it's the same thing. So I have a real objection to the people who focus only on money. To me, money is just a small part of what it is that we do. It's a very interesting part, but I think economists miss it when they try to break everything down into money, because, you know, most of the stuff I do is not for money. You know, the money to me is just an intermediary.
Now, coming from the left, like you said, it's a quarter of the current libertarian population seems to come from the left. Is that your estimation?
Yeah, I would say either somewhere between a third to a quarter are kind of, they come from the left. You know, the remainder probably come from the conservative side. And now we're actually seeing second generation and third generation libertarians, which is, to me, is shocking to see. Remember, I actually became a libertarian. I didn't even know that there was a term. So you know, when people say, "Oh, libertarianism's time has passed," I go, "You have no idea what it was like." We didn't have a term. We weren't using the term.
And I need to apologize to my audience. We're talking in the morning, and I have sun coming in my window that it never sees me. And it's reflecting off my desk, and it's giving me so much light, it looks like I'm almost, I don't know, either an angelic or a ghost. I don't know. This is very odd. I should start doing something.
Well, I guess some of the Quora commenters are wrong, Timothy.
Yeah.
You are, in fact, not a vampire. We have proof.
Yeah.
Video.
Do you engage with left thought or right thought more often? How do you deal differently with people who come from the right, from the left? Do you have a method to your madness?
No, I really don't. I really don't. I mean, I think that the argument should appeal to leftists like how I was. And I have to say, I spent decades with my wife kicking me under the table until my shin was black and blue, talking to our leftist friends, trying to get them to see that the contradictions that they held don't have to be contradictions. The goals that they want are best provided by following this consistent humanistic ethic. And for me, it's just easier to talk to rightists. And I don't know why that is. But the people on the right tend to be less dogmatic, less faith-based, which is odd because you have the fundamentalist, right? But even the fundamentalists whom I talk to, I can have a more respectful conversation with them than I can with the left, who have the Nolan chart.
Sure.
Personal liberty on one side and economic liberty on the other side. And I have a couple of things where I say, this is where we were in the 1970s, and this is where we are now. And I always have the left moving down into that authoritarian space. Because if you look at the 60s, so much of the 60s and 70s was we ought to be able to express ourselves. We ought to be given freedom. We should not be intervening in other countries. If I want to sell this T-shirt, no, the man shouldn't be telling me how to sell this T-shirt. It was, you go back and look at a lot of those 60s songs, and you go, oh, that's a libertarian song. That's a libertarian. Now, somehow that got morphed into this authoritarian socialist perspective. And I don't understand how that happened. I really don't. But anyway, so my experience has been that even though most of my friends are leftists, even though I operate mostly in leftist circles, I'm probably more successful with rightists in terms of people willing to listen, not getting emotional, not attacking me immediately. I'm always being attacked as a racist, a fascist, a Nazi, just lots and lots of names. I go, okay, let's take a look at whether that's true.
Yeah, it's an astounding thing. The fascist label especially is annoying, since it makes no sense whatsoever. I recommend to people my previous podcast with David Ramsay Steele, because he was very good on what the meaning of fascism was. And obviously, libertarianism is not fascist. This is so obvious that when somebody even implies it, you begin to wonder about their sanity. I mean, this is so contra what the things are. When people talk about things that are very distant from us, cosmology, or what the atoms, what's beneath the atoms. We don't have any direct experience, so we don't have a lot of. It's all very theoretical, and the information is hard to grasp. But fascism, this is their go-to. It's a very interesting problem, and the left seems to project more than it used to. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Is that the things that they do are what they accuse others of? Mm-hmm. And I think it's because the welfare state is at critical juncture now. It's developing around the world into a problem, into a financial disaster in the making that people aren't recognizing, but everybody kind of knows. And there are a number of issues like that where everybody kind of knows that something is really horribly wrong, and the left and the right are both putting a good face on it, but the left is going crazy and the right voted for Trump. So that's an interesting problem. But I have a lot of theories about this, and we can discuss them some other time. On Quora, I think the first interaction I had from you, and I could be wrong, was you suggesting a bunch of changes to something I wrote. Is that correct?
I don't remember that. I try not to do that, Timothy, just because I have so much trouble myself. And, I always appreciate when someone tells me to change things. So,
no, that's what I thought. Is that was those helpful comments. I didn't take them all, but it was helpful comments. Maybe it wasn't you, because I didn't pay that much attention to who it was. But that's always been in my head, that Dennis is trying very hard to say this the best way possible, and it comes across in your writing.
I think when I first started, I had some hypotheses. So always start with ethics. Write only to the open and curious. Disengage from anti-libertarian trolls immediately. I have a one turn the other cheek rule. When someone comes at me and accuses me and is really rude to me, I try to find something in what they're saying to kind of acknowledge and say, yeah, and a lot of times I'll say, yeah, if I believe that about myself, I too would be angry with myself, you know. But that's not what I believe. And so I try one, turn the other cheek, and if they still come back at me, I just, Quora has a great thing where you can block people, and we're so outnumbered. I just block them, and because I'm looking for that open and curious. It's a very small number of people, but it pleases me greatly because I get messages every single day from people who thank me for my writing, who say that they've never really thought up these issues through, and they're really changing their perspectives and their viewpoints. So whereas before I spent decades talking to people who kind of just patted me on the head and go, yeah, you're totally unreasonable, and of course we have to have the rulership ruled by us. I happen to talk to a lot of people who are pretty high up in the rulership, and so they always thought, well, of course, we're the elites, we should be running things. This whole idea that what if they made a mistake? We won't make mistakes. So kind of that arrogance of elitism. It just wasn't a good fertile land for me to be planting these ideas. I find Quora to be.
Really, we should probably recommend people to go to Liberty at Large. Is that the correct place?
Yeah, well, I would recommend people think hard about how, especially those who want to proselytize. And that's really what it is. It's a proselytization. I think they ought to be thinking about, to whom do you communicate these ideas? And if it's not working with the sets of people that you're targeting, don't waste your life. There are very few of us. And so you have to be extremely careful. I think Quora is a great space. I think, though, that if you go on Quora and you just write things off the top of your head, you're not going to get a lot of views. You have to have that continuous learning. How can I communicate these hard ideas to these people who just don't see the world like I do, right? And learning how to do that. But you can go to Liberty at Large, which is on Quora, which is our libertarian space, and share your favorite libertarian pieces. And what it is you just provide a link in 250 characters for why this is really important. And it's actually a great way of leveraging one's own knowledge. So, all these things that have had a really major impact on you, and you can share it with people who are there because they're open and curious, because they're liberty curious. And so why not do that? It's an easy way to get your ideas across. And, if you really want to learn how to write, I have to tell you, it's a hard process for me. I'm just not a natural writer. And so it was a hard process for me to learn, but it's learnable. If you're willing to be humble and willing to know that your stuff sucks, but that you can actually improve it. You can use the feedback, think hard, and improve it. And look at other people who are actually doing a good job and say, okay, well, what are they doing that I'm not? So anyway, that's what I recommend. I recommend that they go on to Quora. I think is a great fishing hole. I highly recommend that they go and follow me, of course. But I have on my page, my profile page, when you put Dennis Pratt in at Quora, I have a tour that goes through all the major sections of my philosophy, and I pull out the most popular answer. So you can kind of go through and see my approach, see how I write, and use that as input to your own style and your own approach. Because I write and I connect to a certain group of people. Other people write and they connect to other people. We need a lot of people out there creating these ripples and finding more people to create those ripples.
Well, on that note, I think we have made a podcast. It's really been great talking to you. If you ever want to come back on again, we probably can do it again.
Great. Well, I'm open to any discussion that you'd like. And I enjoy talking about these ideas. So, count me in.
The video of this podcast can be found on the LocoFoco channel at YouTube. The audio can be found at locofoco.net, and you can interact with us at locofoco.us.